Hey there, CS360 students. So in this recording, we're going to talk about what SQLite is and how it can be implemented briefly in an Android application. In a separate recording, there will be more details on its actual implementation. This is just going to be a high-level view of what SQLite is as a database, and then again, how to implement it in an Android application. So SQLite is a SQL database. So some of you have probably had a SQL, your database course. So SQLite is a very lightweight, non-server based database engine. It supports all the typical SQL type statements, things like create, select, update, and delete. And I use SQLite to prototype any kind of database that I want to create. So before I get too far along, what I do want you to use, software that you might find very useful, is a software called DB Browser for SQLite. This is a great GUI system to open a database, edit it, create tables, manipulate data, and so forth. So all you have to do is Google DB Browser for SQLite, and you will find this. I would highly encourage you to download and install this. And I'm going to kind of show you how a database looks like and works with using this tool right here. So coming back into here, Android provides native support for SQLite. You are going to use the SQLite Open Helper class. And what you're going to do is you're going to extend a implementation of your own. So this is going to inherit all of the functionality that SQLite Open Helper has. Now, some database ideas in here, you can see that they are going to have the name of the database. So that is a final constant because this database name is not going to change. And the abbreviation for it is or the extension for it is .db. You could call it .sql3, .sqlite, whatever name you want to give it. .db is just fine. They're also going to provide a versioning for the table there. So version gets used. Where does that get used? Right here. So they're going to pass the versioning up to the SQLite Open Helper constructor. All right. So to create this movie database class, you do have to have the app context. So that needs to be coming from either an activity. So typically in the main activity, I would create my instance of this. In fact, I would actually take this one step further and I would create this as a singleton where I have a get instance method. If you've already watched the shared preferences video, I go through that in my implementation. All right, next thing we have is a bunch of constants strings. So we have the table name and then the columns that are associated with this data. So a movie has an ID, a title, a rating, and then number of stars. I'm going to kind of wonder what difference is rating and stars, but anyways. On the onCreate method that gets called by the SQLite Open Helper class, what we're going to do is we're going to create the table. So if you're not familiar with SQL, this is a SQL statement where we're going to create table. We're going to concatenate the name of the table. Then we're going to concatenate the column ID. We're going to say that it is a type integer, that it's a primary key, and that it's going to auto increment. Followed by, so then there's a comma, the next column is the title, it's going to be text, the rating is text, and then the number of stars is a float. So this detail right here creates the SQL statement that's going to make the table. So when this is called, it's going to create the table if it doesn't exist. So if the table already exists, then it's not going to overwrite it. We also have an onUpgrade method here. So here you can see that they actually drop the table if it exists. So if we're upgrading, then it drops the table, and then it's going to call the onCreate method right there. Okay. All right, so let's continue on. Keep in mind, once that database gets created, it's going to be in your package name underneath data, the data folder, and then you can see databases, it's going to be in that folder right there. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that database operations may take longer if the Android device is busy doing lots of work. Good practice is to always do these on a background thread, not on a UI thread. So this is a programming concept. You always want to do data operations on a background thread, not on the user interface thread. All right, so if we want to insert information into a table, you can see here that they have a method called add movie. We're going to get our reference to the database. We have the values that we create, and then we're going to do put methods where we give the column names and then the values that are associated with them. Once we have the values added, we're then going to do a db.insert. We give it the name of the table, and then we give it the values as well. Off the top of my head, I would have to go see what the insert null parameter is here. I'm not sure what it is off the top of my head. And then what they did is this insert method will return back the primary key. So then that's a useful thing that we might return back to the user. All right, so we can get information from the database. And to do that, what we're going to do is, again, we're going to call the getReadableDatabase method, get our reference to the database. And then we're going to write a SQL statement, select star, so select all from whatever table we're pulling from, where, in this case, a rating is going to be tied to a parameter value. In this case, it's a string that's passed in. So what we're going to do next is we're going to create a cursor. This is going to let us iterate through the database table that we get back. We do a db.raw query, providing it the SQL, and then we provide an array of the parameter values. So in this case, we have only one parameter, and it's going to be the rating that came in here. This is correct form for querying a database. You don't want to hard code things in here. You always want to eventually apply what the query parameter is in a separate statement. And then what this code's going to do, so if we do have values, so if we can move to the first value, then we're going to grab the ID, title, rated value, and stars that we get from this query. So cursor, we do .get long. That's going to give us a long value back. Get string, we're going to get back string values. So we have to know exactly what kind of data types we are pulling from. So IDs were integers or longs. The title is a string. The rating, oh, that's why they have the rating as a string. It's that rating and not like a rating in terms of stars. So rating gets a get string method, and then the stars is a float. Now, what about these zeros, ones, twos, and threes? This is going to be the order of the column values that they were first created with. So when we created that table earlier, we went ID, title, rated, and stars. So unfortunately, you do have to know the order of they're going to come in, as well as the data types that they are. So this will grab the information, and you can see here they're just going to log it to the console. Perhaps we might create a list of this information and then return it back out to the UI for them to display in, say, a recycler view. But that's what this code is doing right here. Again, I just pointed out we want to avoid SQL injection. That's why you see the details using the raw query with the where clause substituting in the arguments. If we want to perform an update to the data, again, we get our reference to the database, we get our values, and then we do a put operation for the column name and the updated value. You can see here that they're going to call the DB's update method, give it the name of the table, the values, and then here they're providing the ID of the entry in the table. So that's an ID that they will eventually add to that list. This then returns how many rows got updated. My personal preference is to always handle one item at a time. And then rather than returning that, or excuse me, let me back up. So this is going to handle any case where the ID is what comes in. Um, if we have multiple rows, that would be okay. But we do want to return some kind of indicator of whether or not this operation was successful. Next one to look at here is deleting information. So if we want to delete a movie out of that table, we just give it the ID, get our reference to the database, we do a db.delete, give it the name of the table, and then we give it the column ID, and then again, we're going to use the query parameter where it gets provided here. All right, so again, this is a light overview of how you can perform the operations in Android with SQLite. Again, I want to jump back here real quick and just show you. So if you've never used a database, this DB browser, great way to create a simple little database. So I'm going to go new database. You can see that I've already got a reference to the study database that we're going to be seeing here in a little bit. We'll call this movies. And I'm going to create my movie table. And so I would give it things like ID, name, and I'll just do rating. Here's where I can set the types. So the ID should not be null, should be a primary key, and it should be auto-incrementing. The name of the movie, that's text, that should not be null. It should have a name. Rating, that's going to be text. It's also not null. I'll do a stars. Just like they had, I'll make it a float, a real number. And we could make this not null if we want to. So it would not necessarily need to be known if it starts out. In fact, if it's a new movie, it's not going to have any stars associated with it. So if I click OK, you can see over here that I've got a table created. And I'm on the Browse Data tab here. And I can click this Insert Row, and I can add movies as I want. So Star Wars. That's a 5. Raiders of the Lost Ark. I think that's PG. We'll give that a 5 as well. These are all just great movies. So you can see that I can add movies here. I'm going to delete out these last 2 entries. And then in this tool, you click Write Changes. And so this information has been written to the database. Another tab that's a very nice one to look at is this database structure. I can see the tables that I have inside this database. And again, browse data lets me again come in here. And if I want to edit it, say I want to add an additional movie or I want to change something, I want to say, oh, nope, it's really not a 5, it's a 4.5. We can update it, write the changes, and all of that is handled pretty easily in here. So again, I'm a big fan of this tool. I highly encourage you, go ahead and download that because we're also going to kind of reference that when we look at some of the implementation details in the Study Helper app.